What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Lucky Shots podcast. Ricky Larson back here with you today for the fantasy show. And what a crazy week of football it was. Hopefully, none of you had the luck I had with fantasy football. Went 0 for 3 in 3 of the leagues that I am in. And I had Dak Prescott in one of those leagues, so gotta find a different way to pivot. Matt Stafford was another one of the quarterbacks I had, so all around bad quarterback play for myself. But today on the show, we'll have the fantasy heroes, the fantasy heartbreaks, some honorable mentions of other guys who had some great weeks, pickups and drop-offs, possible week 2 heroes, but we're going to start out with the injury news from last week. You got Najee Harris, came out of the game with a foot injury. Still haven't seen an update on that. I don't know if it is super serious or not, but if he is going to miss any time, the backup there in Pittsburgh is Jaylen Warren, who we got to see a little bit throughout the game against Cincinnati. Then you have Elijah Mitchell. He suffered a knee injury out about 4 to 6 weeks, or was he the 6-month guy? I think he was, or not 6 month. I don't know. He's out for quite a bit, a lengthy period of time, and not good. I mean, he had a knee injury to kind of begin with. Now this, you would think that the 49ers would have some sort of training program for their running backs to not get hurt, because it seems like every year we're talking about a San Francisco running back who's hurt. So he will be out for the foreseeable future. Jeff Wilson will look to probably be the lead guy now moving forward for San Francisco. Keenan Allen came out of his game with a hamstring injury. So we all know the hamstring issue. It is a reoccurring thing. So hopefully, for his sake, he will take a decent amount of time off, let that fully get under control before he comes back, instead of coming back, re-aggravating it, continuing to go in and out. Hopefully he just stays out for a little bit and can get that healthy so he can finish out the fantasy season much better. And the guys behind him, you have Mike Williams, who you would think would be that top guy, but last week he didn't have Keenan Allen in most of the game and still finished with not a lot, 2 catches. So hopefully we see more out of him without Keenan Allen being in the lineup. But the guy who did kind of shine was DeAndre Carter. He could be somebody you go look at on the waiver wire if you had Keenan Allen as a possible replacement. He had 3 catches, 64 yards, and a touchdown. Not a crazy stat line, but did get a touchdown, had a few targets. We'll have to see how that progresses throughout the period of Keenan Allen being gone. Then T. Higgins, he left the game last week with a concussion. Obviously, concussions, he could be back next week, could not. Just has to clear that concussion protocol, but a guy definitely to eye is as his replacement is Tyler Boyd. He had 4 catches, 33 yards, and a touchdown last week. So, if T. Higgins isn't in next week, misses that game, Tyler Boyd could see a lot more production. So that's somebody to look out for as well. Dak Prescott, I'm sure everybody has seen, broke his hand. I believe he got surgery yesterday, maybe he didn't get surgery yesterday. Maybe it was today he's getting surgery. Either way, he's going to be out for about 6 weeks. So, hopefully he comes back soon. Broke something in his finger, his thumb, on his throwing hand. So obviously has to get surgery for that. And we'll see how it affects him when he does come back. And then Chris Godwin, who was questionable coming into the game, left the game with a hamstring injury. So who knows how that's going to look. Julio Jones would be the guy to possibly inherit some of that role. He had 3 catches, 69 yards, receiving and 17 rushing yards. They were really trying to get him involved. So without Chris Godwin, you can imagine that he's going to be a little more involved than he already was. So that's the main injury update coming out of last week. Let's get into the fantasy heroes now. For your quarterback position, obviously Patrick Mahomes. He had 360 yards passing, 5 rushing yards, and 5 touchdowns for 34.9 points. I had questions, doubts about Kansas City. What would it look like without Tyreek Hill? You still got a heavy dose of Travis Kelce and a lot more spreading the ball around. Mahomes has a lot of options. Kansas City's still good. Patrick Mahomes, especially as a fantasy quarterback, is still good. So no need to worry about him. Great week that he had. Josh Allen started out the week super hot. He had 297 passing yards, 56 rushing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a rushing touchdown. Did throw an interception, but still finished at over 30 points with 31.48. And then kind of a shocker, Carson Wentz had 313 passing yards, 12 rushing yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, had a 2-point conversion for 27.72 fantasy points. He's a guy that probably is sitting on your waiver wire if you did have Dak Prescott. He could be comparable to try to maybe get you through the next 6 weeks, 6 to 7 to 8 weeks. He's got plenty of weapons around him. He's got Jahan Dotson, who made an impact this past week. Curtis Samuel, who kind of made a roaring comeback for himself. Terry McLaurin, who's still good. De'Ami Brown, who was usable last year. So he's got plenty of weapons. Had a good week 1, so we'll have to see how that goes. For the running back position, 2 guys that we talked about before the season started, and I've said it a few times. I think these 2 guys, if they're healthy, could be the top 2 running backs in the league. Well, they were the 1 and 2 this week. Saquon Barkley finished as the running back 1 with 164 rushing yards, 30 receiving yards on 6 catches, had a rushing touchdown, a 2-point conversion. He finished out the week with 33.4 fantasy points. Absolute monster. Pretty much I could say the reason that the Giants won that game. So good to see him healthy. Probably could be seeing him at this level for the whole season, barring any injury. Then you have Jonathan Taylor, who was right behind him in rushing yards, 161 on the ground, 14 receiving yards on 4 catches. He also had a rushing touchdown and scored you 27.5 fantasy points in the tie against Houston. So plenty of questionable calls. We'll talk about that in the game day show for the Colts, but Taylor probably could have scored at least 2 more touchdowns had play calling been a little better, and he could have taken over that running back 1 spot. And then DeAndre Swift rolls in at number 3 with 144 rushing yards, 31 receiving yards, 3 catches, a rushing touchdown for 26.5 fantasy points. Guy's a stud. You probably drafted him as a stud. Had a heck of a game. So I think you can expect more of that throughout the year. He's just a good player, and on an offense where you've got a couple other guys, but they're receivers. You have Jamal Williams behind you, but he's not that bell cow guy. 144 yards from DeAndre Swift. Definitely something that you like to see. Mostly all the same similar names at the wide receiver position. Justin Jefferson absolutely torched Green Bay's defense. He had 9 catches for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns for 39.4 fantasy points. Green Bay looks suspect. Justin Jefferson took over. Then you had Cooper Kupp. In a game where the Rams looked awful, Cooper Kupp still looked good with 13 catches, 128 yards, and a touchdown for 31.8 fantasy points. Cooper Kupp being Cooper Kupp, can probably expect to see the same kind of weeks out of him for the rest of the year. And then Davante Adams, new team, same Davante Adams, 10 catches, 141 yards, a touchdown for 30.1 fantasy points. definitely was the focal point of that offense, as he should be, and wasn't enough to get the Raiders the win, but probably enough to help you get a fantasy win this week. Then you had Travis Kelce at the tight end position, shocker, as the top tight end with 8 catches, 121 yards, and a touchdown for 26.1 fantasy points. Again, we talked about it with Mahomes. Nothing's changed. Chiefs are fine. Travis Kelce's still going to get you about 20 points a game. So if you drafted him, good job. Then you had O.J. Howard. The stat line doesn't sound great. 2 catches for 38 yards. But both the catches were for a touchdown. So 2 touchdowns for him. Pulled the Mike Evans special. Only catching touchdowns. 17.8 fantasy points for him on the Houston Texans. Then you had Taysom Hill. Yes, he is still listed as a tight end, even though came in as like the running quarterback, the running back sometimes, the tight end. You know Taysom Hill. He's all over the place. And at a tight end position, if you can get 15.3 fantasy points, it's pretty good for you. He had 1 catch for 2 yards and a touchdown, and 81 rushing yards for a touchdown as well. All those guys helped you win weeks. These guys helped you lose the week. Me specifically, looking at quite a few guys on this list. Fantasy heartbreaks, you got Aaron Rodgers, 195 passing yards, -1 rushing yard, an interception and a fumble for a measly 3.7 points. They didn't look good. Don't look in sync. Who knows when they're going to get that figured out, but hopefully soon for anybody who drafted Aaron Rodgers. Then Matt Stafford, personal hit here, 240 passing yards, 2 rushing yards, 3 interceptions, and a touchdown for a measly 7.8. And then also hitting personally here, Dak Prescott. Went out because of that hand injury, had 134 passing yards, 11 rushing yards, and an interception for 4.46 fantasy points. At the running back position, probably the biggest letdown for anybody who had this guy, Cam Akers. Not applicable. He was on the field for maybe a few plays at the end of the game. It was all Darrell Henderson. Not exactly sure if that's how it's going to look for the whole year. If it is, and Darrell Henderson is on your waiver wire, go pick him up because Cam Akers did not touch the ball. Then you had Alvin Kamara, 39 rushing yards, 7 receiving yards on 3 catches. Not like the stat line we're used to seeing, only 3 catches. We'll have to see if that's how this year continues for him, if that's the route this offense goes. New coach, fairly new quarterback. Jameis, didn't play a lot last year. So if 7.6 is all you're going to get out of Kamara, it's going to be a rough season for you. Then you had Damian Harris, another personal hit here, 48 rushing yards, decent, 10 receiving yards and 2 catches, but he only got you 7.8 fantasy points. When you had somebody like Kareem Hunt sitting on your bench, it would have been a lot nicer to play him. And then Ezekiel Elliott, 52 rushing yards, -3 receiving yards and 1 catch for 5.6. He looked pretty decent running the football, so maybe that is a silver lining here. And we'll have to see what his role turns into without Dak. But yeah, if you drafted Zeke and you only got 5 points out of him, probably helped lose you the week. Then at the wide receiver position, Darnell Mooney had 8 receiving yards on 1 catch, 1.8. Can't read into it too much. That game was absolutely sloppy. It was puddles of rain on the ground. So don't panic yet on Darnell Mooney. Let's see him get a decent weather game to where they can actually play offense and not just slide around like the cons in the longest yard. Hopefully, you don't have to worry about him too much. But this week, definitely hurt you. Robert Woods, another guy, personally hurt me. 13 receiving yards on 1 catch for 2.3 fantasy points. And I was going back and forth between playing him or Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin got hurt, but he outscored Robert Woods on his first catch. So at least that would have been a little better. Then we talked about him a little earlier. Mike Williams had 2 catches for 10 yards. That was without Keenan Allen for most of the game, so that's also not good. also a personal hit. He was in that same lineup for 3 points. So, rough week. Looking at this list, all of them on one of my teams or more. Yeah, you can see why I went 0-3. For the tight end position, Mike Gesicki. This is a guy you probably were questioning before the season because of the addition of Tyreek Hill. Already having Jalen Waddle, who is a really good receiver. He had 1 catch for 1 yard. 1.1 fantasy points. So, big loss for you there if you had Mike Gesicki. Dawson Knox had success last year. Not in this game. 1 catch for 5 yards, 1.5 fantasy points. The silver lining there is Josh Allen had a huge game. Maybe Dawson Knox starts getting involved in that. You have to hope because he was decent last year and got involved last year. So maybe just week 1 the connection wasn't there. Maybe that builds throughout the year. And then Kyle Pitts, 2 catches for 19 yards, only 3.9 fantasy points. Being that he was the second or third tight end taken in the fantasy draft, most drafts, that ain't going to cut it. That's a big discrepancy from the number 1 tight end who's drafted, Travis Kelce, getting 26, the number 2 guy getting 3.9. That's going to be tough for you. Some honorable mentions, guys who did pretty good this week that you probably didn't expect to be up in these upper echelon for points. Jameis Winston finished as the quarterback 6 with 21.66 fantasy points. Most of that came in the second half, but if you for some reason had Jameis started, you're happy with that stat line. Kareem Hunt, sitting on my bench, was the running back 4 for the week. Had 23 fantasy points. Dontrell Hilliard, a running back for the Tennessee Titans, not named Derrick Henry, scored 21.9 fantasy points, finished running back 7. Michael Pittman, he was a guy that a lot of people had high hopes for, and rightly so, 27.1 fantasy points, the wide receiver 5 for this year. And then Michael Thomas, he had 22.7 fantasy points, ending as the wide receiver 8. Devin Duvernay had 21.4 as the wide receiver 9. Will Disley had 13.3, finished as the tight end number 5. A lot of that is thanks to shoddy defense from the Broncos and just a wide open trot to the end zone. But he was targeted quite a bit, so he's somebody that wouldn't be terrible to look at if you have a bad tight end room. The pick up and drop off. We got Carson Wentz. He had 313 passing yards, 12 rushing yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, a 2-point conversion. He's only 16% rostered, scored 27.72 fantasy points. Again, if you had Dak Prescott, you had a guy like maybe Matthew Stafford who didn't score how you wanted him to, possibly Carson Wentz is a guy to pick up. Jameis Winston, 269 passing yards, 9 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2-point conversion. Didn't see an interception on the stat line, so that's also a nice perk. Had 21.66 fantasy points. He is 36% rostered, so still fairly available. He would be another option for you. At the running back position, don't jump on this one too hard, but just keep him in the back of your mind. Maybe pick him up, don't start him, see how week 2 goes. But Dontrell Hilliard, who we just talked about, he had 8 rushing yards and 3 catches for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns for 21.9 fantasy points, only 4.2% rostered. Again, I wouldn't hop on the hype train immediately, but may not hurt to go out and get him, put him on your bench, see if he continues to do this. Then maybe plug him in as a flex. Darrell Henderson, he is 45% rostered, but that's 55% of leagues that don't have him, and he turned out to be the guy for the Rams last Thursday. Had 47 rushing yards, 5 receiving yards for 26, 5 receptions for 26 receiving yards, 12.3 fantasy points. He didn't tear up the scoreboard, but 12.3 was a lot more than Damian Harris got me. So I would definitely like to have Darrell Henderson on the squad. And you hope that the Rams offense gets it figured out and he possibly adds touchdowns to that, giving you close to 20-point games. Devin Duvernay, talked about him a little bit. He had 4 catches, 54 yards, and 2 touchdowns, ended with 21.4 fantasy points. He is only 2.4% rostered. Again, not another one that you can jump on because it is on the Ravens offense. You don't quite know if you can count on any Ravens wide receiver. I mean, even Mark Andrews had a bad fantasy game, but it was Devin Duvernay who was the guy. So, again, proceed with caution, but he's somebody to look at if you're kind of wanting some big play capability in your flex spot. Robbie Anderson, this is a guy that you could probably count on as a wide receiver 2 or flex. He had 5 catches, 102 yards, and a touchdown. One of those was a long touchdown, finishing with 21.2 fantasy points. He's 37% rostered, still fairly available. So he's somebody that I would consider picking up because he had like 8 targets as well. So that's a healthy amount of targets. That's a healthy stat line, and that's a pretty dang good fantasy score at a wide receiver position. Then Curtis Samuel had 8 catches, 55 yards, 17 rushing yards, a touchdown. He fumbled once, but ended with 19.2 fantasy points, 8.4% rostered. So he definitely was back in a big way. It's kind of what I hoped to see last year, but maybe now he is fully healthy. And Terry McLaurin kind of wasn't, a factor in that game, but Curtis Samuel was. 8 catches. I'm not sure how many targets he had, but that is a good stat line, a good healthy amount of targets. Possibly he's somebody you can go pick up off the waiver wire because he is very available, and count on him. Then you had Gerald Everett for the Chargers. He had 3 catches, 54 yards, and a touchdown, finished with 14.4, and he's only 13.5% rostered, and he plays with probably one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league in Justin Herbert. And again, if Keenan Allen isn't in, possibly we see somewhere near the same stat line, maybe a little better for Gerald Everett. And then O.J. Howard, he's another one not to jump on, but 2 touchdowns jumps off the board. 2 catches, 38 yards, 2 touchdowns, 17.8. And he is less than 1% rostered. So can't hurt to go pick him up and put him on your bench. See if this continues with Houston, or if maybe this was a 1-week thing, then you can, drop him pretty quick. But I wouldn't mind 17.8 fantasy points or even 15, 1 touchdown out of him would be nice. Week 2 heroes now to finish up the show. Hopefully these guys get it done. I think they should. Josh Allen, obviously, I think is going to get it done against Tennessee. He's projected 24.5 fantasy points. Tennessee gave up 16 points to Daniel Jones last week. Danny Dimes. Daniel Jones. And they lost that game. Buffalo just went in against the Rams, and Josh Allen scored 31.48 fantasy points. I would say LA's defense is probably better than the Titans' defense. So I think Josh Allen bumps himself into the quarterback 1 spot this week. Huge game out of him is what I suspect. Carson Wentz could be another week 2 fantasy hero. He was a fantasy hero last week. I think he could be there again. He's going up against Detroit. Projected 18.3, and Detroit gave up 24.72 to Jalen Hurts last week. Hurts mostly got that done on the ground, but Hurts, again, we don't trust as a passing quarterback. He's not going to get his points passing, but Kirk Cousins threw for 313 last week. Detroit, stayed in that game. If we get in another shootout like Detroit was in last week, I think Carson Wentz could have another huge week. Then you have Dalvin Cook going up against Philly. He's projected 18. Philly gave up 42 points between 2 running backs last week against Detroit. Gave up the number 3 running back and let Jamal Williams, I think, get 2 touchdowns. So Dalvin Cook's the main guy. You got to expect that he's going to be eating up fantasy points this week. Then I believe Javonte Williams against Houston is going to have a huge week. Broncos did lose, but the one bright spot, in my opinion, besides fumbling on the goal line, was Javonte Williams. He's projected 15.5. Houston gave up 27.5 to Jonathan Taylor last week. But here's the big stat that I really want to look at. Javonte had 11 catches. Is he a receiving back along with being a hell of a runner? Could be a huge gem, especially in a game against Houston. So I think Javonte is primed to have a big, big week. Then I believe Terry McLaurin against Detroit. He's projected 14.3. Detroit gave up 25.5 to A.J. Brown last week. The only problem is maybe that stat line going to be Curtis Samuels instead of Terry McLaurin's? I don't think so. I think McLaurin is still the number 1 receiver in that wide receiver room. It may just take some time for him and Carson Wentz to get acquainted. This week would be a great week to do it, going up against Detroit, who gave up 25.5 to A.J. Brown last week. Obviously, Justin Jefferson, he's going up against Philly. 19.7 fantasy points is what he's projected, and Philly gave up 39 points to Detroit wide receivers last week. Justin Jefferson scored that by himself last week. So could be seeing a 40-point week coming from Justin Jefferson. And, I mean, again, he had nearly 200 receiving yards. Dear Lord, he's gonna clean up this week against Philly. Then for the tight ends, I like Dalton Schultz going up against Cincinnati. He's only projected 10. Cincinnati gave up 12.5 to Freiermuth last week. But Schultz is reliable, and it's going to be a backup quarterback. Schultz got pretty involved this past week. Now it's a backup quarterback. He's a big target right in the middle of the field, most of the time close to the offensive line. I think he's going to get plenty of work, and Cincinnati's defense was okay last week, but even if he gets 12.5 like Freiermuth did, he's going to outscore his projection. And then, screw it, give me O.J. Howard against Denver. He's only projected 3.6, but Denver gave up 13.3 to Disley last week. Didn't even cover him on one play, and Howard is a touchdown target. Scored 2 last week. Who's to say against a Broncos defense who apparently doesn't like to cover the tight end? Who's to say he's not going to get at least a touchdown? So I like O.J. Howard as well. But that is it for the fantasy show today, guys. Tune in tomorrow. I'll be with Dylan Corbett for the Lucky Bets podcast. So that will be up hopefully around noonish, maybe a little later than that. But catch that tomorrow. And then on Thursday, we'll have the game day show. You'll hear my weekly picks. And then we will get into Thursday night football with the Chiefs and the Los Angeles Chargers. So that ought to be fun. Again, if you want to listen to this on podcast form, you can over on Spotify, Apple Music, Anchor, any of those places that you listen to podcasts. Hopefully next week we will be live on Twitch instead of just the playback here on YouTube. But that is it for today. Tune in tomorrow. Be with Dylan Corbett. And thanks for watching, guys.